Yeah,
What are we talking about today?
we're talking about the merge.
The merge.
Actually, we're just probably going to do some GitHub stuff. What are you working on these days?
Oh boy, too many things probably. I'm working on Preston Werner Ventures, so angel investing in tech companies, climate tech as well. AI these days, of course, that's everybody is investing, doing that.
What types of companies do you find interesting in the AI space? I
Well,
feel like it's kind of difficult to differentiate yourself, you know?
It's hard right now, I think, because there's so much change that's happening.
Yeah.
And how do you invest in a company when the technology is so early? I think we're going to see a lot of the companies that are being founded today not survive terribly long as the ground underneath them changes. Like, how many years will it be until like an LLM that is way more sophisticated than anybody has today is just built into iOS on your phone?
Yeah. And it doesn't go to the cloud. I mean, it kind of goes back to what we're trying to talk about, which is the merge is kind of about developer experience. I'm going to do this as you. How did you find? How did you build communities around GitHub? Like, is that something? I can't remember 100%. Like, I remember that it started mostly with Ruby, and we kind of expanded out from there. And I remember very specifically being like, okay, now we want to go into .NET or something. We think it's ready, right? But it was like years later. Like, we were really kind of specifically focusing on individual cohorts of software developers. But like, for the companies that you invest in or that you're advising for, like, how do you advise them to go to market or to find, product market fit in a software development community? Like how do companies that build software developer tools these days get software developers to fall in love with them?
Yeah, I think for GitHub, I think it was really about the smaller software communities, like Ruby, like you said. Yeah. Obviously, we started there. That's what we all knew. Those were the meetups that we were going to in San Francisco. And then Rails came on board, which was this huge endorsement of it. And then
they came on board very early too.
Yeah, right? It was really early.
Like way earlier than it should have been.
It didn't seem that early back then because we were like trying to get them to. We're like, you should totally come over, and they're like, yeah, no, we're not gonna do that. But then like 3 months later, they did, and that was only 6 months or so into GitHub's existence. So it was super early.
Do you think this is something that's unique to the Ruby community to some degree, that they'll, like, I've felt lately in trying to do Git Butler stuff that I learned some lessons a little bit wrong because I was kind of spoiled by the Ruby community, where like stuff doesn't have to be like 100% done and like perfect and ready, and they're not generally working at these huge companies that have a lot of like rules and processes and regulations and stuff that you have to follow. They're not like, is it SOC 2 compliant? Like, they didn't care about that so much. They're like, does it work, and does it help make me a little bit happier?
It makes me happy as a developer, so it's good enough.
And so I'm curious if, like, how specific to Ruby that is, or how generally applicable it can be. Like, can you go into some place that's using, nowadays, React or like, sort of like a JavaScript framework that like, is that community vastly different than what the Ruby, because I feel the Ruby community is very similar to what it was. Like, if I go to Ruby conferences or something, but I feel like I don't know the JavaScript community, or the Python community, I think, is coming up a lot because of the AI stuff as well. And so, like, do you think if you're writing software developer tools that those communities are massively different than the ones that we kind of got our foothold with?
They feel different in that they feel bigger. The JavaScript world especially is so huge and fast moving. I think people do tolerate a lot of chaos in the JavaScript and TypeScript communities.
Yeah.
And people love bolting things together. It's like the whole NPM ecosystem. Like, the whole package management ecosystem is like, break it down into these tiny parts and then compose things together. And people tolerate that, but it doesn't feel like Ruby to me in that way. I think Ruby was really special in the adoption of a lot of new things.
Yeah. Well, so I'm trying to figure this out as well, because I feel like some things I dislike about sort of the JavaScript, like the new JavaScript communities of building web websites with React or with Next or with Redwood or whatever, where I feel like people are okay having something brand new, right? Like something that isn't really battle tested.
Yeah,
I feel like JavaScript is even worse. Like they'll be like, oh, this framework came up yesterday. Like I'll try that and I'll put that into production or something. Whereas the Rails community is very like, if you hire a Rails person or Ruby person, there's only one thing that they're really going to build websites in. If you hire a JavaScript person, like, first off, it's like, is it TypeScript or JavaScript? And you're like, oh my God, like does it matter? It's fine. and then it's like, so I feel like to some degree they will just adopt new things, but there's not a cohesion, right, where it can kind of spread through the community the way that it could through the Ruby community.
Maybe it's that it takes longer for new things to become popular enough to propagate far, right? Like creating a new thing in the JavaScript world is very difficult because there's so many options.
Well, is it because there isn't like a zeitgeist, like a thought leadership or something that's kind of helps set there's too many sort of
I think there's
people that are saying here's what the right way to do something is.
There's no one kingmaker, so to speak, in that community. It's this evolution over time. It's very organic, like it's totally uncontrolled. The Ruby world felt much smaller. So maybe it was the size. Maybe in general it's just the size of the communities that changed that behavior.
So I guess like going back to that, do you think that there are certain things that make software development communities happy, right? That if you're doing a software development tool, that you can say, here's the things that I want to make sure I do well that is somewhat broadly applicable or applicable at least to a large enough group to kind of get a foothold, right? And or to make sure that it's not just your scratch that you're itching, right? That it's a larger community as well.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, going back to GitHub, Rails was that sort of bellwether for the Ruby community. It was the largest Ruby project. A lot of reasonably sized companies were sort of using it. And so when Rails did something, that was this big signal for everyone that like, oh, I guess this is like a new thing that we're doing now. Like, oh, we're using Git now? All right. And then the whole community came over.
Yeah.
But the landscape of software development has become, in a lot of ways, much more complicated than it was 15 years ago.
How so?
In that there's so much choice.
Yeah.
And so making those decisions is I think a big part of it. So I mean, for Redwood, for the JavaScript framework that we're trying to do with Redwood, we're trying to remove some of that choice, actually go against the grain of JavaScript and say, choose fewer things. Like, hey, these technologies work really well together. Put them together. We'll put them together for you. We'll make sure they're beautifully integrated. And now you can just get to work building your product, which is what Rails felt like.
Yeah.
It was like, don't make any choices, just use
Unless
Rails.
you really care.
Follow
right?
the path.
Yeah.
Right. If you need to do something super weird, like here's the escape hatch and how you can kind of do that. You can build it yourself or whatever. But in JavaScript, it's just, there is no, like things don't settle down very often, I think.
Yeah. So actually, I wasn't there in the first, I think I started at GitHub 6 months or so after you and Chris and PJ were working on stuff. So remind me, because I get asked this all the time, right? Like, how did GitHub start? Or like, what was the early day things? And I know from when I started, right, which was, GitHub was already a thing. And even when I started as an employee, and when GitHub was like technically founded, right? Like when we started GitHub Inc. as opposed to Logical Awesome, it was a little bit farther down the road. So, but just so that I can answer people when they ask me, like I get two things. One is kind of how did GitHub start, and the other is, do you know Linus, right? So let me ask you those things, because now I want to know, do you know Linus?
I met him once.
When
at
did
a
you meet
conference.
him?
It was at some conference. It was during a lunch or something. And I happened to sit down next to him or something. I probably saw him and I was like, I should probably know this person who created Git that this whole company's based on. And I sat down and talked to him, and it was it went about the way that you probably would expect it to go.
He was like, fuck off.
He's like, what are you doing? Like, why would you do that? Which is how generally the Git and Linux, people were towards GitHub. They're like, why are you trying to make this easy? Like the whole point is that this is hard. This is supposed to be hard to contribute to Linux. Like we want this to be hard.
Yeah. No, I have a little anecdote. Did I tell you my Linus anecdote from? So I met at a thing in Berlin somebody I think that works at GitHub, and was telling me that Linus's daughter interned at GitHub. fairly recently.
Oh, nice.
And so Linus had, like, he always hated pull requests. He never wanted to open one and stuff. And then she, I think, was even working on pull requests, like as part of her internship, and had some project, and he opened a pull request to a project of his daughter's. Is what I've heard.
That's amazing.
And anecdotally, he was like, "It's not as bad as
He's like, actually,
it's not good. It's
15
not what I
years
would do.
later,
But it's not.
Hey,
okay,
maybe they learned something.
Fine.
I remember submitting a patch to Git itself, and it being the most terrifying thing that you could possibly do, because you had to submit it on the mailing list, and you had to get your line endings correct. So that it would be things would be wrapped, and if they
Gmail or
tried
something,
to,
you're
no, it was horrible. And I mean, I use Gmail, so I'm like, how do I even get this into their system without it getting all mangled, and then they'll think I'm an idiot.
Yeah.
Right, and it took me like weeks to like get through the process of git format email or whatever that command is called to like submit it to the like. How does anything ever happen? How do you like? There's the progress is so slow, and I mean, but for certain projects like Linux, like this was always their thing. Like,
yeah, I mean, their contribution guide is like 100 pages long. It is really, it's really quite
super
difficult.
daunting, right? But it's this filter, like they use it as this. But that to me was always, that always felt like a red herring is not the right word, but like that's the wrong way to do it, right? That's not where the filter should be.
Well, yeah, you're right. I suppose it depends on the project. Like, actually, I was just talking to somebody who has a relatively popular open source project, like not a huge one, but like it has, I don't know, a couple thousand stars or whatever. It has some people contributing to it, and he was like, I hate open source so much because I love open sourcing it, right? And I love good contributors.
Yeah.
But there's so much, there's so many people that come in thinking, you owe it to me to write this feature that I need, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's open source. Like, at the whole point, write the feature yourself.
Yeah.
Like, I'll
by all means.
I'll look at it, but there is a toxic sort of part of the community that I think has come up somewhat more recently than obviously than the beginning of GitHub. But like, GitHub helped create that, for better or for worse.
It definitely
it made things so
made it
easy
worse
to a way.
in that aspect. Yes, it made it easier for people to come along and complain about stuff. Not that was it never stopped people before, right? It was just in different places.
Yeah, I mean, it's just if it's so difficult to create a bug report or a request for a change, an issue of some sort, then if you make it so hard, like the Linux kernel, then you can't have. It's impossible for people to complain because they don't have the energy to get through the complaint process.
Right.
But I'm not saying that's better or worse. I find it kind of funny that like it's kind of come to a degree full circle of like people being like, how do I make it a little bit harder so that I have good contributions, right? Because the community is just so broad now.
Yeah, I mean, open source to me is really special, and sometimes I think that people are thinking about it the wrong way. To me, open source was always about, I'm going to create this thing, I'm going to put it out there so that anyone can use it for anything. So I always licensed everything under MIT license, which is like, use it for anything you want, do anything you want with it. You can't like sue me. You can't make me pay you money for you using my thing wrong, right? Right. Which is, and open source is just about the purity of contribution. Like, it was never about anything financial. Like, as soon as you cross that territory into something that requires some kind of a transaction with companies or whatever, then to me, it's less interesting. Then it's just like, okay, write software and sell it. Like, if you want to get paid to write software, then just charge for your software.
Yeah. Actually, that brings me to kind of an interesting one. So I'm talking to David from Sentry here in a little while, and they just came out with this BSL license, because they're sort of an open, and you must have invested in a lot of companies like this as well that have sort of an open core.
Yeah, I have. Yes.
And maybe everybody tries to figure out kind of, how do we monetize this, right? Like, I feel like the more that I think about this and talk to people, that this might be a little bit of, like, close to one of the themes of the merge, is trying to figure out, if you love software development tools, like, you want to make it open source. Like, I think a lot of people have that sort of in their DNA, especially now. Man, side question, or side comment, but I found it very funny because I'm doing some more conference talks and stuff, and I remember going up and trying to convince people to use, not even GitHub, just to use Git, right?
Yeah,
and being like, look at how cool Git is. And now we're so old, and we've been around so long that I'll go up and the whole audience is full of people who have never used anything other
Yeah,
than Git.
right.
Like they don't even know, they don't really have context of what happened because they've been using it for 15, like it's been dominant for 15
That's
years
what they
almost,
learned
right?
in college.
And they're like, yeah, there's other
or high
version
school
control.
these
What
days.
are you talking about?
No, I know, totally.
But we can get back to that. What I find really interesting is software developers. I think a lot of software developers, especially ones that write software development tooling, love open source. Right? Grew up on open source, learned how to program in a lot of cases through open source stuff, and then they build a software development tool, but they need to make money off of it. Right? Like they need to be able to monetize it somehow. And so I think a lot of people struggle with that. Right? Like we're building Git Butler, we're trying to figure out it's not even do we? It's can we open source the client, or does that open us up somehow, right? Does that make things more difficult for us to succeed, and thus to put more effort and resources into this thing that we're trying to produce? So I'm curious if companies that you've invested in or advised or anything you've worked on, recently have thought about this, right? So so what Sentry does is they have a BSL, I think, the business software license, and so it's open source, but kind of dual license. Like you can't use it commercially in something that competes with your product, and that's it, right? You can do anything else. It's essentially MIT, and then you choose at the end of I think 2 years, it'll convert into MIT. So if your company adopts it or whatever, and then this company goes out of business, then it just converts into MIT. So it will be MIT eventually, right? Like it's just you can't use it to compete with them right now. And I actually find that kind of a nice middle ground, right? Of do I open source it or do I dual license it, or do I come up with something complex? It's like it's basically MIT. It's just not MIT for a couple of years if you're doing something that directly competes. But I'm curious if you've run into anything else, or if you know of models that kind of help bridge this gap so that people can open source it, or like know how to monetize developer tools in a way that developers are happy with, open source developers are happy with, like the communities, and is good for the business.
Yeah, I think it often comes down to what can you charge for. So you could do a license, right? But you're creating a challenging situation where you've got a bunch of people who are using it supposedly under some open source license, right? Maybe they're just playing around with it. They're starting to play around with it within their company. Like, how do you know when they start to use it on the business side?
Yeah.
I think MySQL has been like this since forever, right?
Yeah.
It's like how many companies are actually paying for that or not paying for that should be? It's probably a lot, right? But would the adoption of MySQL be as high as it is today if it weren't, right?
Yeah.
So it's like a lot of people use the open source strategy as kind of a marketing tool. It's like, hey, more people will use it if it's open source.
Right.
More people will be able to try it out without having to go through some process to pay for it or get some trial or whatever. So then it's always trade-offs. Can you then still monetize the main thing by having a dual license? Yes, but it becomes a little bit more challenging without without putting people through that path to begin with. But sometimes you can have an open core and then you charge for something around it, like hosting, right? So think of Next.js, for instance, right? Uses this model. Next.js is open source, but Vercel is sort of built around hosting Next.js applications.
When do you advise, like when would you recommend that somebody open source something, right? Like if they're working on a development, like what do you think a company gets out of it that's the most valuable?
Back in the GitHub days, I wrote a blog post. You can look it up. It's called Open Source Almost Everything. And back then, my thinking was...
If this is on YouTube, maybe we can go, link here.
Link here. Press this.
Smash the subscribe button.
The gist of that blog post is, if it's core to your business, then keep it closed source, because then it's proprietary and people want that, and then they'll pay for it. If it's good, if it makes their lives better, you can sell it in the traditional way.
Right.
If there are things that you're building for your company that any company could benefit from, not just a competitor of yours, for instance, then open source that and give it away for free. So for instance, for GitHub, that was GitHub, the GitHub.com, sort of the core web SaaS application, has always been closed source. But then we open sourced Grit originally, which was the Git, Ruby Git bindings. So how you programmatically use Git from within Ruby. That was always open source from day one. Because lots of people could use that to do lots of different things other than just hosting Git repositories and building a social network around code hosting. But all of these other things that we built internally, like
Yeah.
Hubot, the sort of the chat bot system, like we open source zillions of things, like basically everything else that we ever built, mostly. Like so much of it became open source because it's great for attracting developers. So I think that's one thing. Some advice I always give is find something within your company that you can open source that is cool, that is awesome, that people like, because it's an amazing way to hire.
Yeah.
To attract attention and get people to want to come and work for you.
So I mean that's one thing. This is finding people to hire, right? Like building up a community around, in at least to some degree, around what you're interested in, if you can. There is overhead to that though, of extracting something out, right, and kind of maintaining that separately, which can be somewhat difficult. Especially. Like it's funny, I run into a lot of companies now that are doing like monorepo. Like it's another one of these like SPA versus server side sort of web building stuff. Like is it monorepo? Do you have a whole bunch of like services and stuff that you can pull in through some sort of package management thing or something? Like how do you have like even in ours is like do we want to do the client and the server through one repository? And I'm like, are you ridiculous? That's like that seems like the worst possible idea. But like larger and larger companies are trying to do that, and a lot of the stuff with Git now is trying to make sparse checkouts and stuff a little bit easier. Okay, so but let's go back to the GitHub story. Tell me about, let's say 6 months before we really knew each other that well. Like how did this project start? Like why was this a thing? I tell people a lot. Like I mean we're both in the business of giving people advice a lot, I think. But I tell people a lot of build something that you wish that was in your life, right? And my assumption is kind of that this is how this has started. But tell me the origin story.
Yeah, so really it came out of work at a company called PowerSet. So I was working at a company called PowerSet in San Francisco. I'd moved up to San Francisco, gotten a job at the startup. I was employee like number 33 or something. And we were building a semantic search engine. So it was like you could type more natural language queries.
So it'd be easier with AI these days.
It would be much, you can actually do this today. Yes, this was 15, 18 years ago. So within that company, I was working on a project that would make the results of this sort of semantic search engine more reliable because it would crash a lot, like all the time. And so you needed to be able to replay the query kind of over and over until it actually succeeded.
Take a seat, buddy.
And so one of my coworkers, Dave Ferrum, and I were working on this project using Subversion. So in the company, we used Subversion to build this whole thing. Everything in the company was Subversion. He had come across Git. So he was the first person that ever introduced me to Git. And he was like, we should use this on our internal project and then synchronize that to Subversion. Like, when we reach
Hold on one second.
when we reach certain points, then we could just push it to Subversion. But we use Git on our side. And we're like, okay, great. So we had to like find a server that wasn't being used.
Hold on. We're filming something, so let's put this in the other room, okay? Well, which one is this? I think this is all, oh no. Here, let's go in here. All right. You were using.
So the company was all Subversion. So we had to find a server to be our sort of Git host thing, right? So we had a Linux server, we created user accounts on it, and we were using Git. And it was amazing, right? Like the branching and merging in Git is just phenomenal. But there was no good web interface, so it was really hard to use. And we, if we wanted to have someone else do it with us, we're like, hey, let me give you a Linux account on this server that you can then log into and SSH to, and then, right? And everyone's just like, I'm not gonna do that. Like, that's ridiculous. So on the one side, we have a technology that's really powerful, and on the other side, we have a difficulty to use it. Like the developer experience is very bad. And so my thought was, I'm a developer, I know how to build websites, and this is awesome, and so I could make a better web interface for this. And so that was the initial inception of it was just that. Like, hey, let's make this easier to use. Because there was, there's like Google Code and SourceForge and stuff. So the model of code hosting was out there. It's just there was nothing for Git.
So, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I feel like it goes back to kind of this core question of what can you build that will be valuable enough to a large group of people that it can be, a good business, right? Or at least an interesting product of some sort.
Yeah, I mean, I had no inclination that this necessarily would ever be big enough. Because, like, who was using Git? The Linux kernel and the Git project, and that was pretty much it at the time.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I mean, that's a good question. When did you think that this was a big thing? Like, I feel like when I started, even we were like, we can probably build like a lifestyle business out of this and buy beer, and like it'd be a fun thing to work on and it'd be nice. But I don't think either of us ever like thought that this would be a $7 billion company.
No,
right?
I never imagined that it would like completely eliminate like all competition within, that it would take down like Google Code. The Google Code would go out of business, right? They would shut it down. They're like, you know what? This is not worth doing anymore. Everyone's using GitHub. Like that was never in my imagination. It was always just scratch your own itch. Like, this is cool. I want to use Git. I'm going to use Git, so I'm going to build my own thing so I can use Git with all my friends. But if I felt that way, then other people maybe feel that way. And so from the very beginning, it had a business model. So prior things that I'd done, like Gravatar, they had no business model. And so when they started to become popular, then it made it harder instead of easier, because now I'm like paying more for servers and nobody's paying me any money, and like I don't know how to do that, right? So with GitHub, it was a side project, but I wanted to make sure that my next side project had a business model so that if it became popular, then it could become my job. So that was in my mind from the beginning.
So was it? So my anecdote on this was that Jeffrey Grosenbach asked to pay us, and that PJ wrote billing code over the weekend so that we could start making money. I realized that was like an idea that you had. Like, was the business model that you had that it would be private code that people would pay for, or was it something different that kind of turned into that when people like Jeffrey were like, "Can I use this for private stuff?"
I think it was always that way from the first time we started thinking about billing.
Okay.
That was just the natural. I don't remember ever considering a different business model other than it's free for open source stuff. For if other people can see it, then it's free, and if you want privacy, then you pay for it, because it aligns so perfectly with a company.
I mean, is that generally kind of your mantra or advice now, is that you want companies to pay for stuff rather than individuals, or do you think that there's opportunities where you can build a business where individual developers or something, that's a good model to have them pay for it, or do you always try to push to, let's have this be kind of free or easy to use for individual developers and try to come up with a way for the companies to pay for it?
I think it's a lot easier. If you can align your price point essentially to the size of the company that's buying it, that's the perfect model, because it scales, right? And so a seat-based model works this way. The more seats that you have, the more that you pay for it, and that aligns perfectly. Like, a small business has a small number of seats and they don't pay much. A large company has a lot of seats and they pay a lot.
That's true, but that wasn't our business model.
No, I know.
A long time.
I know. on purpose, right? So we weren't doing it, right? We had a repository-based model where you paid for the number of private repositories that you had. But that was intentional because we wanted it to be very low effort for people to add contributors, because that was the big change with Git, that more contributors made it better and more awesome. Because of the merging and branching, the branching and merging was so great that the more people you had, you could actually do a lot more. And so it was part of changing people's mindset to be like, oh, I can just add more people for free to my repository. We had to change people's behavior to get them to shift to it, or at least that was the strategy.
Yeah, no. So I'm curious. Do you still think that? So the way that obviously GitHub has pivoted, and this is fairly recently, is that individuals, like, everything's free, right? At a level.
Yeah. And
then there's like add-ons and stuff, and then even at a team, even at like organizational levels, it's like you have to get to a certain size or need certain GitHub actions or something like that before you start paying, which is great from a growth perspective, right? Like, now it's so easy to bring people on because it just doesn't cost anything. Do you think do you think that maybe we should have started along that line of being like, generally things are free, or at a very low level things are free? Like, I agree that bringing in people was really valuable, but like, could it have even sort of grown fast? Like, it's weird because we weren't really like a VC-backed company, right?
Yeah.
So we didn't really have all of the money to be like growth at any cost.
We weren't trying to grow weirdly fast, right?
Yeah.
We were just trying to grow. So I think what we did worked out. I mean.
Yeah, no, it's impossible to argue that it didn't.
But I think the one thing that I would change is change to a seat-based pricing model a little earlier.
Yeah.
Like maybe a year earlier.
What? So I find this kind of interesting from the GitHub perspective as well, which is why is there no new GitHub? Like, has GitHub just been, this is sort of this, I mean, I remember you talking about innovator's dilemma and stuff, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but like, why is there, the only other, real GitHub sort of competition space is GitLab, which is essentially just GitHub, right? Like, it's not really massively any different in any useful way.
It's very similar. I give them credit for, they innovated some things, I think, when things at GitHub slowed down a little bit. But it is very similar. The two of them sort of fill exactly the same need, right? But yeah, why isn't something sort of pushing GitHub out of business?
Yeah, or even Git.
New.
Like, I mean, from that perspective, right? Like, one could argue that Git is even, like, older from a contribution perspective or from a usability perspective or whatever than Git, and it hasn't changed much. Like, I wrote 2 editions of a book, and they're like, write a 3rd edition. I'm like, with what? Like, it's not. I mean, I can put in sparse checkouts, but like, who gives a shit? This isn't selling books, right? Like, I don't know what really is massively different than it was. Like, why is the innovator dilemma sort of problem doesn't seem to be a problem in the version control space?
I think,
and not only that, it's like all converged, right? There's not really. I mean, there's perforce. You can it's still kind of there, but even they're doing Git now, right?
There's only some weird companies use something different. Like Google has, I think.
Yeah, I mean, when they get to huge monorepo space,
they've really changed some stuff.
I mean, but they're still using essentially a patched Mercurial, right? Like, but so I'm just curious why. Like, it felt like when GitHub started, there was like this who's going to win this war of 10 version control systems that are all kind of
it was Mercurial versus Darks versus
Arch versus Bazaar.
Yeah, there were so many. I think here's my hypothesis. I think it's because it's achieved a level of good enoughness,
local maximum problem,
combined with it really sucks to change.
Yeah.
Like, we've built, like, Git now is the core of so much DevOps. Like, these Git-based workflows are so integral now to how we develop things that thinking about trying to change that, and then combined with just the power of the network of GitHub.
I mean, it's interesting because that's not even really a version control. Like, it's not even like an aspect of version control, right? Like, the DevOps stuff isn't built on diffing or merging or any, like, it's just built on moving bits. Like, it's a better FTP, right?
Yeah, it is, yes. But it integrates with what you're already using.
Yeah.
And I think it's way more deeply ingrained than Subversion, for instance, ever was. Like, changing from Subversion to Git was painful, but changing from Git to something else would be like next level painful now. So I think it's good enough.
Yeah.
But I don't think that it's forever. I don't think Git is forever. I think that eventually, things with AI are going to change software development so much that it's impossible to predict what we'll even need from a version control perspective in the future.
Yeah, I get asked that a lot as well, and I'm sure that you do even more so because you're investing in companies that do this type of thing. But I guess quickly, because I feel like a lot of people talk about this, and I find it a little bit boring, but I am kind of curious generally, like, what do you think the role of software development becomes? Like in, I don't know, let's say something interesting, 20 years, right?
Yeah. I think humans are writing a lot less low-level code in the same way that we used to write assembly.
Well, I mean, I made the argument at some point that GitHub was kind of the first version. Like if you start a new project, you're starting with 50,000 lines of code. You open up a gem file and put in 10 lines, right? Sure. And you're starting already with weeks worth of work that you don't have to do. Right?
Yeah, open source. The prevalence of open source has really changed the level from which we can begin. Right. So you have a framework now. You're not building your own framework if you're building a web app, right? You're starting with Rails or Redwood or whatever you're using. You're starting and you're building from there. I think with AI, we go up another level. 20 years it's almost impossible to predict on a 20-year scale.
Yeah, although GitHub started 15 years ago, right?
Well, that's true. Fuck. So that, like, is there a GitHub style thing that, like, changes the ecosystem of software development so significantly that then it's good enough in that same kind of a way and incorporated so deeply that we don't want to then change how we build stuff? I'm guessing not. I mean, because it's a completely different paradigm. Like, Git is, so here's another reason. Because how we write code hasn't changed in 50 years. Right. We type into text editors. Like, that hasn't changed. That's been so consistent. And so GitHub, from a version control perspective, has become good enough, and the underlying way that we create software hasn't changed. But now, so here's the thing, AI can fundamentally change how we write software
Right.
in a way where we're not writing into text files so much anymore. Maybe now we're having conversations with AI subsystems that are helping us create and refine a system more like in Star Trek. We're like, could you add this field to this form and have that saved into, this place in this
Right.
database, right? And it's like, sure, here you go, boom, I coded that for you. And like, you could check the code if you wanted to, but eventually it's good enough that like, you don't need to. And it writes its tests and it runs them. And it's like, yeah, here's, it just shows you what it's doing. You can show its work if you want.
Yeah.
But that we're not called on to write that kind of code much anymore, at least for the most of what people are doing. Maybe software developers are still working on AI, right? Until we reach the singularity when the AI is now improving
then who
itself,
cares?
right? We still have to make the AI better, right? So we're writing code at least until the AI is better than at writing AI, better AI systems than we are.
I made the argument at some point talking about this that it also, how much does it matter how good you are at writing code in a lot of what people are, like, I'm thinking about it from the writing, web services or writing developer tools or something like that. But a lot of it is not like, are you the best programmer? Or can you write the best code? Mm-hmm. Or like, do you have an idea of what is useful to people?
What do you want to build? What's the product?
Like, because there's lots of crap that gets built very well, right? Like, there's a lot of bad ideas that are excellently engineered.
True, yes.
And then there's, all the code I write, which is horrible, but hopefully there's some good ideas in there somewhere. And like, as long as it works, right? Then I guess I guess the question is, can AI have taste at some point, right? Mm-hmm. Like, can AI, will it get to something where it's not just good at producing an output, or even iterating on that or something, but that it has a concept of what to build that can be useful.
Right. Well, I think this is a higher level question, which is, how human will general artificial intelligence be? Because I don't think it will be human in the way that we understand it. Because to be human is to be emotional, is to have all of these varied things that have happened to us that tell us that inform what our taste is in a specific moment in time. All the traumas that we went through as kids, all the nostalgia that we have. Like, a general AI system isn't going to be built that way. It's not going, probably not, right? Like, are we going to try to build an AI and have it grow up and, it's not going to it's not going to come into the world in the same way that we do. And so I don't think we can expect it to have all of the same characteristics that we do. So I think AIs for many years, and maybe we achieve that someday, maybe 50 years from now or something. Like, we reach a point where we're like, yeah, we have a convincingly fully human-ish AI. But I think that's going to take a long time, and it's going to be specialized. They'll become specialized in the meantime.
Yeah, from writing, we've been writing developer tools. We've been really interested in developer experience for a long time. Like, speaking about 20 years from now, with AI, with whatever, like, what would your ideal software development experience be? Like, how do you want to create things digitally? Like ideally, right? Like, if we weren't using Git and GitHub and text editors and whatever, right? But I need to create something that computers run that helps somebody with their lives or whatever. Like, what could that look like? What would be interesting to you?
It probably looks somewhat like how I work on the Redwood project today, which is I don't write much code for it anymore. I operate at a higher level of thinking about the strategy and the interface of it, the developer experience of it. So I think I want to be the designer. I want to be, and I mean that from not a design how it looks, but like a systems designer. Like, what does it need to do? How does it interface with the person that's using it, right? So for Redwood, that's like the public interface. That's the public API. Like, what do you as a consumer, as a framework, you're building an app, you're using Redwood as a framework. How do you interface with it? Like, what is that touch point? For an application, that would be like, what is it? What are the screens? Like, what is the flow? What's the information architecture? Like, I operate these days at that level. And I work with a team of people who are capable of implementing like those ideas, and we all ideate together and come up with that together. But to
that's
me,
what's interesting to you about
yeah,
writing
that's what's
software.
interesting. So writing code to me has always been a means to an end.
Yeah.
I mean, I like writing code, but I write code to create a thing. I don't need to
You're not
necessarily
going to
write
miss.
the code.
Actually, do you miss writing code? Do you write
Well,
code
sure.
very much?
I mean, the abstract notion of writing code is satisfying, but I think I think it will become like a craftsperson thing. I think in 10 years.
Well, like writing assembly now or something.
Right, exactly. In 10 years, if you're like, yeah, I sat down and I wrote this Ruby program to do this thing, people would be like, I mean, okay, that's weird, but good for you. In the same way that if I'm like, you know what, I sat down and I carved this spoon and now I'm eating my cereal with my spoon that I carved, you'd be like, okay, that's weird, but kind of cool. It'd be that same thing. It's like you hand-rolled something
Yeah, I
that
could see that.
machines could do for you just as easily, but you did it because it was a satisfying craft of a process. So I think code will become that, where it's like, if you really like writing code, sure, sit down and hand-roll your algorithm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not completely unlike that today to like a much lesser extent where we're not writing machine code or assembly or something like that.
Exactly,
right? Like
exactly.
we have abstractions and we have open source and we're kind of gluing them together with and every once in a while you go down a rabbit hole or whatever and figure out some, thing at the bit level that is messed up in a protocol or something like that. And you're like, man, that was very satisfying.
Right. But I think that's fine. I think that's progress.
Yeah.
Right.
But so you're saying it'll kind of go more down that direction, and really what you would love is to not be dealing with the code as much. Or I mean, we come from this version control background. Like, how do you see that working in that world, right? Of you trying to build something bigger with a group of people, and you do it one way and they do it some other way. Like, are we looking at merge conflicts? Like, is something helping us with the merge? Is there a middle AI thing that does merge conflict resolution in a way that it thinks satisfies both parties? Like, how do you collaborate when something's producing code?
Yeah. Well, I think we'll always need version control in some sense, right? Even if we're talking to the robots and the robots are writing the code for us, we'll still need to say, here's what the thing looked like at point A, and then I talked to the machine, and here's what it made it look like at point B, and I might need to go back to point A, and I really need to know exactly what changed between A and B. Like, I think that remains for a very long time.
Yeah.
And so GitHub can still do that though, right? Because the machines are still writing code, and you could still go look at that code and audit it. So I think it looks like that for at least another
I feel like
5 years.
that's almost the easy one where it's like, computers can remember everything, right? Like it can remember everything you asked and everything that it produced, and
that's
theoretically true. there can be. I mean, even now we only have what we run git commit on. It'd be nice if it just recorded everything that ever existed, right?
Right, every single
and you could be like,
change.
what it looked like 5 minutes ago, and that's always an answerable question.
That's true. Maybe we're not writing commit messages in the same way anymore, right? Like the machines are remembering. You're like, hey, remember when we added that field to that form? Could you bring that up for me, what it looked like right before that?
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, oh yeah, here you go, and here's the app, and here's it running in a isolated environment with what the database looked like at that time. Like, right? Maybe they're doing.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do cool stuff like that, where we're Minority Report, like. You put your hand on the screen and you go like this, and it's like, and it shows you like everything that happened.
Only if we get cool 3-fingered gloves.
I know. You get really strong arms working on those interfaces though all day, right?
It's tiring to do that. If you've used VR for anything, they're like, we're gonna have all our UI up here, and I was like,
Exactly.
I don't know if I can do enough.
You got to train to go be a programmer. Do your bicep curls.
Yeah, no, I find it interesting because I keep thinking about this from a sorry, I said I was going to end it and now we keep going, but like this is the idea of how you collaborate is very interesting to me because GitHub made a model that everybody's kind of adopted,
right.
And Linux kernel had a very different model with the same tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like sending patch series to a mailing list, like that's their commenting system, that's the review system, like. Then they leave some reviews, and then what do? You re-roll the patch series, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you go back and you rebase stuff, and you say, okay, here's again 3 commits that are all individually documented, and the review process is at the commit level. But people, they know that everybody involved in this process has gone through enough that they can rebase everything, and they know how to work the tools and stuff like that. But that idea of being like, okay, here's a nice patch series. After everything's done, I'm going to create it in this nicely documented thing, and send it for review, and everybody looks at it, and I'll take whatever feedback and not create a new commit that's like address some stuff and push it to your PR, but
Yeah.
re-roll your series and be like, okay, this is,
Yeah.
but like, you're right, like maybe writing commit messages becomes stupid at some point. Like,
Yeah.
like maybe that can be automated to some
Well, I
degree
like that.
of
You know,
description, right?
if the AI is just watching all the time and it can make sense of what we're doing and sort of collect things together in a more logical way than we have time to, you know, unless you're very diligent about collecting your commits together and making them all logical, right? Like that should be something that a computer can do. If it can watch and be like, oh yeah, so all these changes were related to this one feature, and hey, here they are, and I don't have to do any of that work, and I don't have to be committing and doing that stuff in the same way that I am today. That's maybe an intermediate change over, you know, the next 5 to 10 years.
That's probably enough for today. I think you win, but I have a sort of mess kind of over here, but this is
I've got a whole
this is
fairyland.
very nice. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we are all excited to have you at the Merge. And
I'll be there.
I'll try to ask you some questions in German too.
Oh, ja.
Ja.
Das ist gut.
Sehr gut. Vielen Dank. Tschüss.
Tschüss.
That was good.
All right, we cut. Yeah.
Yeah.